Welcome to the 5th Annual Food Justice Film Festival presented by the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm Linda Rico, Food Justice Film Festival organizer with the Center. One of the films we are featuring this year is Dolores, written, produced, and directed by Peter Bratt. Dolores is an award-winning film that tells the story of Dolores Huerta, one of the most important activists in American history. She co-founded the United Farm Workers Union with Cesar Chavez and tirelessly led the fight for civil rights and labor justice alongside him. Dolores is one of the most defiant feminists of the 20th century, and she continues to fight to this day. Peter Bratt is a Rockefeller Fellow, a Peabody Award winner, an Emmy-nominated award-winning film director, writer, and producer, and a social justice activist. I'm so happy to be joined today by Peter himself. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for speaking with me today.
Great. It's great to be here, Linda. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about your background. I recently learned that your family was part of the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz, the Wounded Knee Standoff, and the Farm Workers Movement. Can you tell me more about your family's involvement in those events and how that family history has inspired the work you do?
Right. I mean, I can't take credit for for my or my family's involvement. That really is my mom. You know, we were all young children. My youngest sister was still, in diapers. When my mom packed us all up and moved us onto Alcatraz in 1969, I was 7. Um, it was Indians of all tribes occupation. It was an 18-month occupation. We lived on the island off and on for 18 months. And also during that time, our mainland home, our house, became a kind of unofficial headquarters where, people arrived to go to Alcatraz, come and take showers, resupply, do laundry, make phone calls to legal counsel and everything else. But it was just a hub. Um, and then, from there, my mother would oftentimes pack all of her 5 children up, put them in the back of a station wagon, and we would join caravans of other Native families and go to, different demonstrations for weeks, sometimes months at a time, including the fishing rights struggle up in Northern California, the Northwest. And then also in 73, my mom was at, the Wounded Knee Standoff. And then as a child, my mom was also organized and worked for the farm workers movement. And then in San Francisco, in the Mission District, where a lot of the activism was kind of planned, organized, and carried out. There was the American Indian Center. I remember spending so much time there, and there was one office building where I think it was the Black Panthers, the farm workers, and AIM all shared the same Xerox machine, to post flyers and make flyers. But it was San Francisco at that time was a hub for social movement building and activism. And so that was kind of the milieu that we grew up in. And so I was acquainted. I knew Dolores as a kid.
Wow.
And then we also spent some time at La Paz. So there was definitely a connection there. My mom knew Dolores. They had organized. And then also, I remember as a child on the island during the occupation of Alcatraz, I remember shiploads of the Black Panthers bringing food and clothing and blankets, and the farm workers bringing the same thing.
Yeah.
So there were definitely there's intersections of support and movement building. And so, fast forwarding and, having the opportunity to make a film about Dolores, it was kind of a full circle moment. And I thought I knew Dolores and I knew who she was until, the film came along. There was so much that I didn't know.
That's incredible. Did you know when you were that young that you wanted to get involved in like film to document these kinds of things, or did that come later?
No, not at all. My mom was a single mom. We were on welfare for most of my childhood, and sometimes, the PG&E would get turned off, the water would get turned off. As I mentioned, our house was a kind of a crash pad, a headquarters. And so it was always crowded. There was one bathroom, it was sometimes chaotic. And I remember as soon as I was a teenager, I was like, man, I'm done with movements. As soon as I can, I'm moving away. I'm going to college. I'm gonna, be a business major. I'm gonna, be a millionaire, and I'm not gonna look back. But
Right.
but that didn't happen. I went on to college, and that's where I became a political science major,
Mhm.
and that's where I was kind of introduced to film and the idea of making film.
That's really cool.
Yeah, but
Um,
it was not. It wasn't on my agenda then.
yeah, it wasn't on your radar yet. You brought up your mom, and I had read a lot about your mom, that she's indigenous from Peru, and that, she, like you said, she raised all of you on her own. And I wanted to know, how did seeing her, and watching her be involved in all these movements, how did that, watching her strength and going through and experiencing her personal experiences in America inspire you to get involved in social justice movements later?
I mean, I don't think you realize until you're older the kinds of principles and values that are instilled in you, um, instilled by the example set by your parents, and then also in the really conscious lessons that they try to inculcate in you. Um, and I didn't really realize until I was in my early 20s, what all that my mom had really cultivated in her children. I want to reflect back to Dolores. One of the more fascinating things about the film was, Dolores has 11 kids,
Mm-hmm.
and because I was also a movement child, when you have a parent who's an activist and an organizer, it when they make a decision, they're making a decision for the entire family. So when my mom got involved in something, we were all packed up in the car, and whether we wanted to or not, we had to go. So I thought that was going to be a really critical part of the story. And so Dolores didn't agree at first, but I think later came to see the importance that it brought to the story
Right.
was involving her 11 kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think like me and my brothers and sisters,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we went along, um, with the flow of the movement, kicking and screaming, like Dolores's kids. But
Mm-hmm.
today, all of Dolores's children are involved in the movement and fight for social justice.
Yeah.
And likewise, my mother's children are all somehow connected to movement building as well. So I feel like those early years, they definitely influence and impact the decisions you make later. So as I mentioned, I went to college thinking, I don't want to have anything to do with movement building, but
Right.
you get pulled into conversation, you see injustice happening, and I feel like it calls you. So
Right. That's really incredible. Well, this year, all four of the films we're featuring, Dolores, The Smell of Money, Into the Weeds, and Invisible Valley, they all discuss or touch on the importance of food and farm worker protections and safety, with the spotlight on migrant and immigrant workers and people of color who are most affected. What was the most eye-opening thing to you while telling Dolores's story and covering her life's work?
I mean, that's a loaded question. There's so many things that I learned about Dolores as an individual,
Mhm,
and also the personal struggles that she overcame as a woman of color,
mhm,
fighting for the labor rights of probably the least empowered labor force in the country,
mhm,
which are farm workers.
right.
Um, just the kind of personal obstacles that she encountered
Mhm,
is like going back to the 40s and 50s. There's still a lot of um, barriers for women of color today,
mhm,
but back then they were they seemed almost insurmountable.
yeah,
So that's one. The other one is just how disenfranchised and dehumanized farm workers had been made to feel. at that time.
Mhm.
You know, the fact that they would live on the land that they cultivated. I mean, it was like one or two steps away from slavery. It was a form of indentured servitude. The low amount of pay, the sexual violations that happened in the fields to women,
Right.
the fact that you had children out there picking with their parents, oftentimes,
Mhm.
farm workers being sprayed with toxic pesticides while they're in the fields because, you know, there was no dignity. They were treated inhumanely.
Right.
Um, and the fact that that went on and that, it wasn't until Cesar and Dolores really kind of shined a light on that.
Mhm.
People, we weren't aware of those things, and that it's also it's this population that picks all the food that we eat every single day. And then right now you look at the climate today and anti-immigration sentiment, and like send them back. If
Right.
if you send immigrants back, you won't eat.
Sweet.
So those are really kind of eye-opening lessons for me.
Mhm.
And fast forward today, farm workers still are largely ununionized and don't have collective bargaining power.
Mhm.
Um, and I still think they're one of the most vulnerable populations when you talk about the American workforce.
Right. I spoke with Dolores a couple of weeks ago, and she really pointed out how even though farm and food workers have been deemed essential workers, and we saw this happen during COVID, um, but everyone kind of forgot about it. And, even though they're deemed essential, they still don't get livable wages. They don't have health care. Most don't. They don't have proper worker protections or safe working environments, like you said, with the pesticides. There's just a lot of a bigger risk to their health. And now with the changing climate, of course, there's the weather stress, the extreme heat, extreme cold. Um, so what do you, in your opinion, what do you think has been the biggest reason for this, where we can't get past this, and like how the United States has been getting away with not supplying these workers with, the health care and the protections that they need?
I mean, I think it's a system that's set up the way it is by design. So, uh, you know, it, agribusiness is corporate power, and the structure is set up to um, disempower
Mhm.
farm labor. So, I think it's deliberately structured this way.
Mhm.
And then again, a lot of farm labor is made up of undocumented workers.
Mhm.
And so there's vulnerability on that side as well, because there's always the threat of deportation, or, oftentimes you hear about workers not getting paid wages, and, well, if you report it, you're going to be deported.
Mhm.
But I think it's deliberately set up this way to disempower and keep people disempowered.
Mhm.
And as Luis Valdez pointed out in the film, um, it was slave labor, had recently ended when large numbers of migrant workers started coming to the United States to work in agribusiness in the fields. And so this system was deliberately set up. It's really one step away from indentured servitude and slavery. It was intentionally set up that way
Mhm.
to, maximize profits and keep wages down as low as possible.
Mhm. From when you were younger and you had, you saw this like firsthand experience, like you said, in these movements with your mom, but seeing the farm worker movement when you were younger and then seeing it when you were actually filming Dolores, what was the biggest difference that you saw, or was it pretty much the same?
Primarily because of the farm worker movement,
Mhm.
uh, changes were made. You can go by any field today, and there are porta potties now in fields. That's a direct outcome.
Mhm.
Um, certain pesticides were banned, but they use sometimes even more lethal pesticides. Workers are no longer in the fields when they spray,
Mhm.
but that that still doesn't protect them from contamination and overspray. And a lot of farm worker communities are near the fields that they tend. So that's still a problem. Wages have improved slightly, but as you mentioned, there are a lot of there are not a lot of protections for workers.
Right.
Health insurance, um, a lot of farm workers, at least in California, like in the Central Valley, a lot of the water in the homes where they live is contaminated. They can't drink it. So, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but ultimately, I think what the pandemic showed is that some of these old systems, they no longer serve us,
Right.
and the systems really need to be restructured and changed.
Yeah.
If you're really gonna like make real and lasting change,
Right. Some of the people that I spoke with during these interviews, they brought that up and how, it easily we forget about the farm workers and the people who are picking and growing and packing and planting and harvesting, the whole thing, all the people that are doing that for our food, and how during the pandemic we were so aware of it because everyone was at home and everybody was worried, how are we going to get these items? But then the minute that we could be outside, it would just kind of became this fleeting thought, no
Yeah.
one really paid attention anymore. And it's one of those things that makes you think, when is our system going to change? And I wanted to get your thoughts on, because you've been involved in this, like what have you seen, or do you think we're close to change? Do you think this is just going to be our continued fight, forever and ever? Or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's going to change when we force it to change. So, it kind of goes back to Dolores, who says, we can march in the street and, put signs in our windows, but if we want to really create change, we have to organize and mobilize, and go to work. So, that means organizing in your community. It means running for a local office. It means getting on, the water board, the school board. It means putting pressure on state and federal electeds, to change policy. But it's not going to happen from the top. As we know historically from movement building, it happens when people put pressure, and that comes from people organizing and creating movements. I do think there are good signs. When you see like the growth of organic farming, and and then some farmers moving away from the kind of agriviz model of planting one crop and using petrochemicals to fertilize and to seed. I think you see small movements happening not just in the United States but all over the planet, and I think those are good signs. But with climate change, happening, I think whether we like it or not, we're gonna be forced to change.
Right. So what was your biggest takeaway after filming Dolores? Like, were you inspired to do another film, in the same realm? Were you inspired to kind of get back to your, social justice, like movement roots? Were you inspired to, um, what were you left with after that?
I mean, every film, I feel like a storyteller, you go on a journey. The film kind of has a life of its own,
Mhm.
and that was the case here. And this was also my very first foray into documentary
Mhm.
filmmaking. I'm, not a doc filmmaker by training.
Mhm.
I do narrative, so but I fell in love with the documentary film form, and I would definitely want to make more documentaries. I still love narrative,
Mhm.
but I feel like uh, it kind of expanded my storytelling skills.
Right.
Doc filmmaking is such a different animal than narrative.
Mhm.
Narrative, it's controlled, it's scripted. You're master of the universe. In a doc, you might have an idea or a sense of a structure
Mhm.
or the direction of a story, but you don't really know what you're going to discover in the process. And I think, um, what really kind of informed the storytelling process with Dolores was
Mhm.
um, it was clear that she had literally been written out of the historical record.
Yeah.
One by the Texas School Board, which kind of is the largest school district in the country, and it sets the tone for all other school districts. So they really have a kind of a monopoly on what curriculum gets printed. So they voted to write Dolores out of the social studies curriculum, and then on a lesser degree, Dolores had been kind of written out of the UFW history as well.
Yeah.
And so in the filmmaking process, I discovered that there was just like this wealth of archival material that literally documented. You could see Dolores like almost by month for
Yeah.
7 decades. Like she is there throughout every step of the way in the historical record. And I would say there was even more materials on Dolores than Cesar.
Mhm.
And so we realized like Dolores has been erased from the record, and yet here she is in the record. So we made a decision like we want to use a lot of this historical footage as much as possible to not just say that she's been there, but to actually demonstrate it.
Right. To
And
show
so
proof.
that was a really an incredible find, and we just used a fraction of what we found, in the film. This film could have been, a series of hour shorts.
Right.
But
Do you think that she was written out because she was a woman, or do you think she was written out because what do you think that reason was?
if you look at the film, what the film really kind of underscores is that, Dolores really lives at the intersection of several different movements.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously labor justice, racial justice, feminism,
Mhm.
climate justice, environmental justice.
Mhm.
As one of the historians in the film point out, the farm workers really kind of, came up with the whole phrase environmental justice. That term did not exist at that time. When people talked about the environment, it was the whales and the trees.
Mhm.
Um, it- you know, People being part of that conversation, that didn't come up.
Right.
But since then we've learned that communities of color are often the victims of environmental injustice. They live near dump sites, toxic brownfields, etc. And so are impacted by different pollutants more than any other, more than the mainstream.
Right.
Um, so with Dolores living at that intersection of all those kinds of struggles, I definitely feel like she was erased, intentionally erased for all the above.
Right.
No, she was she wasn't going in, she was a feminist, and she was not going anywhere. And I think male power like resented her for that.
Yeah.
She's a social democrat, so capitalists um didn't like her.
Yeah, they don't like that.
Agribusiness didn't like her for trying to empower workers,
Mhm.
a labor organizer.
Mhm.
And then the farm worker fight was also for racial justice.
Mhm.
And people didn't like, her bringing that conversation, into the spotlight. So
Mhm.
I think for all those different reasons, she was deliberately, removed from the record.
Yeah. So I wanted to know, what do you think the future of food justice and farm worker justice looks like?
I mean, I can only reflect back what I see happening in the my own community, the
Mhm.
American Indian community here in San Francisco,
Mhm.
um, where the community's one asking for land back. The majority of natives today live in cities, and
Mhm.
so natives are fighting for access to green spaces,
Right. Mhm.
not just to grow food, but also to have ceremony.
Mhm.
Um, and I think like as I mentioned earlier, you do see a movement happening of people wanting to connect more to not just the land, but also to have a hand in the food that they consume on a daily basis. And then of course there's all this empirical data that shows, when you are out in nature and you touch the earth, or you work with plants, like cortisol levels go down, stress levels. So there's a growing awareness about about the benefits of being in the natural world. But I think that, food justice, food sovereignty movements, you see communities of color really mobilizing. And I would say, not just communities of color, but all communities.
Mhm.
And again, not just in the US, but all around the world.
Right.
Some of it is a response to the climate change
Mhm.
challenges that are impacting frontline communities.
Mhm.
But a lot of it is also just there are people who are making lifestyle choices
Right.
and are wanting to move away from the kind of agro petrochemical food model right now, food
Mhm.
production,
Right.
which not only produces unhealthy foods, but it produces a really unbalanced labor
Yeah.
labor market.
But I
I mean,
think.
one of the things I wish that we could have covered in the film, and I mean, definitely like
Mhm.
the labor relations and the imbalance you find in agribusiness is certainly there.
Right.
On the other side of it, a lot of the foods that are grown and then, processed
Mhm.
and then marketed and then, are consumed in largely communities of color.
Mhm.
I know in our community, as in other communities of color, there's a huge challenge. The number one killer right now is diabetes and obesity in our young people,
Mhm.
and that's a direct result of the food that is being consumed and marketed
Mhm.
to our people. So uh, again, but that's a system that that's deliberately set
Right.
up in that way.
Mhm.
So you have these food deserts and food islands, and you go,
Mhm.
reservation tribal territories where options for fresh and healthy foods are oftentimes unavailable. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of organizing and mobilizing that needs to be done. I mean, we see it happening, I think, in communities, but I believe it has to happen on a larger scale.
Right. Absolutely. I wanted to leave some space for you to share any projects that you're working on or any ways that we can uplift, you know, um, maybe some action items that you have or anything like that. Just a space to kind of give you and let you share what we should look out for and how we can support you.
Well, great. Yeah, my brother Benjamin and I, we have and our partner Al Peter Patel, we have a small production company. So we have a few narrative and documentary shorts and feature length, projects in the works.
Mhm.
And then on the community level, I work with an organization called the Friendship House Association of American Indians, and I am the project director for what we call the Village SF.
Mhm.
It's a really broad initiative to create a cultural social service hub for urban American Indians in San Francisco Bay Area. And part of a really exciting part of that
Mhm.
is that the city's returning 3.8 acres for the Indian community to steward, and it's going to be a ceremonial community farm site
Oh,
in an urban area. So it's going to produce a number, I think, 7,000 pounds of traditional foods and medicines. And so it kind of is connected to some of this of what we're talking about. So
right.
really excited about that, and we're going to be breaking ground, I believe, in early 2025.
Wow, that's amazing. That's incredible. I love hearing that. And what's the website that people can go and
You can go to the Friendship House Association of American Indians,
okay.
or Friendship House SF.
Okay. I'll be sure to share that and put it on our site too. That's
Great.
incredible. That's wonderful. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
I think that's about it. As Dolores would just say, she has every opportunity to organize people, and right now, she's knocking on doors, registering folks to vote. And so I
Yeah,
would just leave you with, the election's less than a month away.
right.
We got to show up. We
Hmm.
have to vote, and so I'll leave you with that.
Yes,
Like, get out there and exercise your power.
definitely. Well, as a reminder to everyone watching, don't forget to sign up for this year's Food Justice Film Festival at foodjusticefilmfestival.com. And as always, the festival is completely free to sign up and completely free to watch all 4 feature films anytime from October 24th through October 27th. And you can also catch all of our 2024 virtual interviews on our website all year long. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.